You know, I have a Bible that has been used so much, it's falling apart. I really need a new Bible. If I can talk my wife into allocating the budget for it, I might get one soon. But it's the reason it's falling apart and it's not going to be useful anymore is because I've used it so much. So it's not so cut and dry that just because something is older, it's better. Provide some input, yes, but not necessarily just carte blanche. Then another rule, a more difficult reading is to be preferred to a simple reading. In other words, if you have a manuscript that says something that's very difficult to understand, or perhaps even causes the writer to contradict himself, that's to be preferred over one that's clear, that it doesn't have the error. Now, I'm not sure about that. But perhaps it should be considered, but these, in my opinion, are very questionable rules to use in establishing the true authoritative text. Another rule, a shorter reading is generally better than a longer reading. Well, we have to make decisions. These are challenges that we have before us as to whether these rules are correct and how we apply them. Again, brethren, we need scholars that are able to understand these issues and look over the shoulder of the academicians that are engaged in this work to examine their techniques and the results. The church needs men like that. So the critical text became the basis of practically all modern English versions. The received text stood as the basis for the authorized King James Version. And we have a fundamental shift here in emphasis. A shift from recognizing the preserved text, as we heard the confession appeal to an effort of restoring the original autographs. And which is best? Well, I don't have the original autographs. And so I can attribute inspiration to them, and the critics cannot assail me because they can't examine the text. There is no text. We don't have that text. So these are issues that we have to grapple with and that our translators in modern days have to address. A fourth major development, and I'm just going to touch on this very briefly because time is running out. The Church of the Living God is supposed to be, in fact it is, the pillar and ground of the truth. And until the 19th century, the work of establishing the text was under the direction of churchmen. Today, this is not the case. The major players in the production of translations reside in corporate boardrooms. And I'm not saying all is woe, I'm just saying that's a tenuous position for us to be in, where perhaps a translation could be dictated by a profit motive rather than the motive of establishing a true, faithful, authoritative text based on the sources. So which text? We have to respond to whether we're believing in a preservation of the text or we're in an effort to restore the text. And we have to respond to these quickly. The other major issue I mentioned was once we have established the text, what philosophy of translation will we use? Now, I want to be careful here because we sometimes oversimplify these decisions also. A literal word-for-word translation has its pros and it has some cons. A dynamic equivalent or a thought-for-thought approach perhaps has some pros and cons as well. And a paraphrase, I'm going to be much more critical of a paraphrase. I really want to warn against the use of a paraphrase as an authoritative text to base decisions of doctrine and life upon. But let's look at a continuum here. And I know this is a very busy slide, but quickly, at this end of the spectrum is the word-for-word approach to translating the text. In other words, if I see a Greek word, I attempt to replace it with an appropriate English word. At the other end of the spectrum, I'm not tied to the words at all very much. I'm looking at word groups, maybe at even paragraph level. And I'm getting some thoughts, and I'm reinterpreting those thoughts and putting those thoughts to my language. Let me just give you an example of this continuum. Proverbs 18:24. The King James Version falls on this end of the spectrum. It's a word-for-word literal approach. Here's what Proverbs 18:24 says. A man that hath friends must show himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. Well, let's go over to the NIV, kind of in the middle of the spectrum. It says, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Not quite as word for word or literal. Let's go over to the Message, which is just an out-and-out paraphrase, and listen to the difference. Friends come and friends go, but a true friend sticks by you like family. Horrible. So there are pros, and personally I lean very much toward a word for word. Why? Because there's less interpretation involved. If there are difficulties, let me grapple with the difficulties. If there is an idiom that is difficult to be expressed in my language, let me work with it. You know what an idiom is? Not idiot like me. No, idiom. A figure of speech that's used in one language everybody understands. Okay? So Dr. Ella wouldn't think this, but he's from Germany, and some of his fellow citizens might think this way. If we said they're learning English and they're here, and you say to one of the your comrades, go cut the light out, they might go get a saw and start, because that's an idiom in our language. Well, sometimes a word-for-word translation gives us challenges in things like the translation of idioms. But it encourages an appreciation for the jots and the tittles of Scripture, the very smallest units of meaning. Dynamic equivalence, I don't want to paint it as all bad. There are some good things about an NIV-type translation. Now, I'm not advocating that be your source of doctrine and your basis of your life, but there are some things that are easier about it. It's easier to read. It flows usually more easy. And it may clarify some of the idioms in the source language. But it often supplies interpretations instead of simple translations. So there are some difficulties with it. Paraphrase, just please be careful with those and how you use them. So the following lectures are going to describe the work of the men who struggle with these issues. They'll talk about some of the fundamental changes that have taken place. Let us celebrate the work of God in bringing us the Scriptures, and let us dedicate ourselves to confronting these issues that we have raised. May God bless you.